There are few among us that did not wonder in awe about what it would be like to be an astronaut. Space exploration will forever pique humanity's interest and curiosity. The prestige of visiting outer space belongs to a proud few, but as technology develops, more and more people will have the opportunity. The Fédération Aéronautique Internationale states that a man or a woman officially becomes an astronaut upon reaching an altitude of over 100 miles. As of March 30th, 2006, 443 people have crossed this imaginary line. Efforts to learn more about space are widespread. Since the astronaut Yuri Gagarin made his pioneering exit out of our atmosphere, men and women from 35 countries have joined his notoriety. During the race to space in the early 1960s, the United States began Project Apollo, a campaign launched to compete with the efforts of Russian scientists and future cosmonauts. With resources going to the Apollo spacecraft, Saturn launch vehicle, and details like mission-specific astronaut suits, the U.S. was finally successful when the Apollo astronauts reached the moon and safely returned in July of 1969. Since the infancy of human presence in space, 18 astronauts have died on missions, and 10 more from launches. Despite this, our interests remain strong and our minds stay determined. Find out more about astronauts and space-related news in our archive of astronaut pictures, articles, and interactive features below.
Millions of people in North Korea are short of food. Perpetually hungry children and pregnant and nursing mothers are suffering the most. The World Food Program reports South Korea's landmark donation, the biggest in more than a decade, will help ease the nutritional crisis faced by 2 million of this particularly vulnerable group of people. Under an agreement worked out by WFP between both countries, South Korea will donate 50,000 metric tons of rice and $4.5 million in cash for food needs in North Korea.
Inside Japan's corporations, the culture emphasizes the success of a company as a whole to be more important than any single individual, which might explain why one study found that 63% of Japanese felt guilty for taking paid leave. But perhaps more concerning is this: long work hours don't necessarily mean high productivity. In fact, Japan has the lowest productivity amongst the G7 nations. Earlier I mentioned the term karoshi. It means death by overwork. It's legally recognized by the government and usually is marked by a heart attack, stroke, or suicide due to stress. There's hundreds of cases of karoshi reported annually, although some argue these cases are underreported and that the real number could exceed that by up to 10 times. An employee of the advertising firm Dentsu jumped to her death in 2015. The cause was said to have been depression caused by overwork. The case generated widespread attention and renewed calls to change the long working hours and illegal unpaid overtime, highly common in Japan. The firm was fined for violating labor standards because she was reportedly forced to work more than 100 hours of overtime per month. The company's CEO even resigned over the controversy. After the death, Dentsu made some changes within the company. One of them, the lights in the office now turn off at 10 p.m. every night in an effort to force employees to leave.
In a chapter of Democracy in America entitled Why the Americans Are Often So Restless in the Midst of Their Prosperity, de Tocqueville sketched an enduring analysis of the relationship between high expectations and dissatisfaction, between political equality and envy. He wrote, when all the prerogatives of birth and fortune have been abolished, when every profession is open to everyone, an ambitious man may think it is easy to launch himself on a great career and feel that he has been called to no common destiny. But this is a delusion which experience quickly corrects. When inequality is the general rule in society, the greatest inequalities attract no attention. But when everything is more or less level, the slightest variation is noticed. That is the reason for the strange melancholy often haunting inhabitants of democracies in the midst of abundance, and of that disgust with life sometimes gripping them even in calm and easy circumstances.
Well, there are many factors that can cause one species to divide into two. One of these is when populations get isolated from each other by something like a lake forming or forest being cleared. And there's another idea that as individuals adapt to their environment, this might have a knock-on effect on mate choice, a process called sensory drive speciation. Now, this seems to occur in cichlid fish. They have shown that a female preference for either red or blue striped males only exists in clear water, where they are actually able to see.
Stem cells are the body's master cells, the raw material from which we are built. Unlike normal body cells, they can reproduce an indefinite number of times and, when manipulated in the right way, can turn themselves into any type of cell in the body. The most versatile stem cells are those found in the embryo at just a few days old. This ball of a few dozen stem cells eventually goes on to form everything that makes up a person. In 1998, James Thomson announced that he had isolated human embryonic stem cells in the laboratory. At last, these powerful cells were within the grasp of scientists to experiment with, understand, and develop into fixes for the things that go wrong.
A few years ago, scientists determined that our thermostats are sexist. Namely, that office climates had been optimized for a hypothetical room full of 40-year-old, 150-pound men, using standards developed more than 50 years ago. And that ends up leaving a lot of women in the cold.
It's called the battle of the thermostat, right?
Tom Chang, a behavioral economist at the USC Marshall School of Business. He says it goes beyond comfort for women.
It seems that it's not just a matter of comfort, but it also affects their productivity.
Chang and his colleague tested that link between temperature and performance by quizzing 543 German students on basic addition skills and word scrambles in rooms that varied from 60 to 90 degrees Fahrenheit.
And if you went from, let's say, the low 60s to the mid 70s, you saw an increase in female performance of almost 15%, 1-5, not 5-0, which I found remarkably large, as much larger than I had expected.
The effects tapered off after the mid 70s. But men, on the other hand, had a small decrease in performance, about 3%, as temperatures rose to the mid-70s.
The professor is talking about clinical psychology.
In order to know how behavior patterns can be changed, the clinical psychologist has to know what causes the client to behave the way he or she does. Identifying the cause is called diagnosis. In diagnosis, a psychologist uses two basic tools, interviews and psychological tests. Through interviews and tests, the psychologist tries to classify the problem to see if it falls into any known categories. A psychologist may also attempt to describe the client's personality in terms of how he or she deals with life. For example, some people like to lead, and some prefer to follow the lead of others. Some people are active and outgoing, while others are quiet and reflective. In a diagnostic interview, the psychologist takes the client's case history. This means learning how the client got along with parents, teachers, and friends, as well as how the person handled difficult situations in the past. Psychological testing is the other way that a psychologist tries to diagnose the client's problems. Clinical psychologists have developed tests that can help them learn about a person's intelligence and personality, as well as tests that show whether a person's behavior or perception is influenced by emotions, disabilities, or other factors. Personality testing is useful in discovering how the client tries to adjust to life. Personality tests can reveal unconscious feelings the person is unable to talk about. This information can be important and could help shorten the length of treatment required.
The basic English person's diet in medieval times was made up of bread, cheese and beef, while ale was the drink for all ages and social classes except for the aristocracy who drank wine. In winter there were no root crops to feed the animals, so they were killed in autumn and the meat salted to preserve it. People kept livestock even in the towns. Cows were usually kept tied or tethered, but pigs were allowed to wander at will, feeding on the rubbish off the streets. By the 16th century, however, choice in foodstuffs had grown, including exotic spices to add flavour to the usual diet. This had come about because European rulers, wanting to increase their power and wealth, and also, in fairness, in the spirit of inquiry and the quest for knowledge, had financed voyages of exploration overseas. This opened up trade routes, bringing precious spices and vast profits from the east, and to the west, Spanish and Portuguese explorers had brought back such novelties as potatoes, tomatoes, maize, peppers, and chocolate. It must be said, though, that it took people some time to accept some of these new foods, as they feared they were poisonous.
Listen to part of a talk in an anthropology class. The professor is discussing culture.
What would human life be without culture? It's impossible for us to imagine what we'd be like without language, without art or religion or technology. Over hundreds of thousands of years of evolution, these aspects of our cultures have become as much a part of us as our anatomy and physiology. We have a lot in common with the people around us. In fact, the number of ideas we have in common with nearby people is very large. A complete list of shared ideas, for example, ideas we share with the people around us, this list would include our ideas about what's right and wrong, what's beautiful and ugly, and so on. Also, our ideas about food, work, love, marriage, every aspect of our lives. Even our rules about how to behave towards strangers, friends, animals, and the earth. Think of a particular group of people, any group, say, for example, college students. If you could take all the ideas and behaviors, all the tools and technology, all the things that college students share as a result of being in contact with each other, you'd have what anthropologists call student culture.
So what you're saying is culture is sort of like a club. College students are a club. It's because our experience is like we go to class, we do homework, we have our computers and cell phones, we hang out with other students. Sometimes we forget what the outside world is like. This is why this what we have in common with other students? It's why our culture makes us feel like part of a club, right?
Well, in a way, a culture is like a club. Neighboring cultures might share the same ideas and rules like neighboring clubs do. But the comparison doesn't completely cut it. Think about it. A club has borders that we can define, but we run into trouble if we try to draw borders around a culture. Culture isn't a thing, it's an idea. Still, even though the idea of culture is problematic, some of us believe that by continuing to study cultures, we will eventually be able to explain the similarities and differences among us.
Number 7.